I'm Kartik Hosanagar. I'm a professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm also the faculty co-director of AI at Wharton. And this is Creative Intelligence, a podcast where we explore the cutting-edge intersection of AI, creativity, and human potential. We'll explore a number of questions like how will AI impact education? How will it impact our workplace? What is the impact on humanity in general? How does it impact our understanding of consciousness? Each week, we'll navigate these questions, looking at how AI is transforming our world and what it means for the future of humanity. Our guest today is Sal Khan. Sal is the founder and CEO of Khan Academy, which is a nonprofit that offers free educational content in math, science, and humanities. If you have a kid in school like me, then of course you already know about Khan Academy. Sal is also the author of this book, Brave New Words: How AI Will Revolutionize Education. Sal, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kartik.
Sal, I asked ChatGPT how I should introduce you today, and here's what ChatGPT came up with. Sal's voice is the soundtrack of math anxiety recovery for millions of children. How do you feel about that?
That's surprisingly poetic. Normally you have to prompt it a little bit to get it to say something that nice.
Yeah, have you heard that before? Did it come up with it, or did it just pick it up from some other website?
I haven't heard it exactly framed that way. I've definitely met some students now who are older, somewhere in their 30s, who say, it's still strange. The voice in my head has my voice unless I'm about to do some math or science, and then it takes on your voice.
Yeah, our producer for this episode, Jaden, was just telling us that as well. He said that Khan Academy helped him get through school and college. So, it's an, sentiment that has been expressed many times before. Sal, I think your founding story is pretty well known by now. You were working in finance, you were teaching your younger cousin over video, and soon you found yourself doing this for dozens of other kids. And of course, that helped launch Khan Academy. I'm curious, when did you realize that what you were doing was much bigger than tutoring a few relatives?
It was a gradual realization. In the late 90s, I'd definitely taken some stabs at entrepreneurship, at tech entrepreneurship. My original background was in technology, and some of them looked pretty promising for a while until the NASDAQ collapsed. And then they all turned into games of Survivor. And then I go to business school, and it's interesting. I went to business school to some degree take recovery from the economy, to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I find myself at this hedge fund, this investment firm, and I'd kind of, my inner narrative said that I'm not an entrepreneur. But I just naturally gravitated to, let's call it, side projects. And when my cousins needed help, and initially, as you mentioned, remotely tutoring them, then I was writing software for them so they could get more practice. Then I was making videos for them based on a friend's suggestion. I had a lot of friends from business schools saying, hey, why are you doing this? How are you going to monetize this? I heard there's already people who are kind of doing stuff like this. How are you going to differentiate? I was like, no, don't give me any of that business school stuff. This is not a business. I'm not monetizing it. This is a family project, and I'm just enjoying it. And all my business school friends were very unsatisfied with that answer. They looked at me like, what's up with Sal? But that was my way of emotionally protecting it. And my brain definitely did gravitate to the grandiose sometimes, especially once I started making things that potentially could scale, like the software and the videos. I started saying, well, if it's working for my cousins, and honestly, I've worked on many projects my whole life. Very few did I even have 10 people tell me that this was really helpful for them, that this was in some ways transformational for them. And my cousins were giving me that feedback, and I was seeing that happen for them. And I was saying, well, if it's working for them, in theory, things like software and video could scale to many, many more folks. And then YouTube, some people have said, oh, you went viral. I went viral very slowly. It was really traditional word of mouth. But when I started to see that usage grow, and I started to see letters from people who weren't my cousins saying that this was really helping them, this is allowing them to go back to college, their children are, this is the only reason why they're able to keep up with their classes, then I felt I was really tapping into something. I didn't know what to make of it. I was still protecting it. I was like, nope, this is not a business. I'm happy with my day job. But in the back of my mind, I said, hey, let me keep working on this. And one day, maybe this could serve millions or billions of folks in my most grandiose moments.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and fast forward to today, Khan Academy's reach and influence has been quite phenomenal. One of your team members shared with me you guys have 170 million registered users in over 190 countries. So that's quite amazing. The part that I find most interesting about this is that the business model, you're a nonprofit, the content is for free, and you entered into this from the world of finance. You just mentioned you had an MBA as well. So this is not what somebody in the business world naturally wants to set up. And if you have these big visions, you kind of think about a for-profit setup. So tell me a little bit about what motivated you to set this up as a nonprofit, keep all this content for free.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a lesson of you never know where your life's going to take you. Even in business school, um, the business school I went to didn't really fail anyone, but they would tell you privately if you really didn't do what you needed to do in a class. And the only class that I, in theory, would have failed is a class called social entrepreneurship. Um, and it was funny because I remember when I took that class, I was very cynical about, okay, I remember the final exam was about a bike ride to cure a disease. And I wrote in my analysis of this nonprofit, I'm like, this bike ride's not going to cure the disease. And yeah, it's going to raise some money, but they're spending more money just even, getting the Gatorade bottles and then renting the police and all that than it's going to the disease. My tune has changed since then, but you could imagine, I was like, oh, it actually raises awareness, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it has a lot of value. But back then I was very cynical. And as you mentioned, the first job out of business school, I'm at a hedge fund, which is kind of only for profit. But it was interesting. While I was at the hedge fund, you really do become a student of capital structure. It's one thing when you study it in business school and you study what happens in control and liquidation preference and all of that. It's a whole other thing when you actually see it in capital markets. And you realize how much people like myself, analysts who are analyzing these companies, who are putting pressure on them for the next quarter or for the next year and trying to just, read the tea leaves of expectations versus reality, how much we were driving these organizations' behavior. And it really is all about capital structure and ownership. And so when Khan Academy started becoming a thing, and I said, wow, this could really affect a lot of folks. There were people who came. By this point, we had moved out to Silicon Valley. My boss's wife had become a professor at Stanford. There were some venture capitalists who reached out who said, hey, I like what you're doing. You're showing that ed tech can really scale and that there's a market for it.
Right. Which is not often, right? EdTech companies struggle to scale.
Yeah, there's a certain irony too that before we came on, I don't want to be once again overly self-aggrandizing, but before we came on the scene, no one wanted to touch ed tech. Like
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
there had been attempts and it never went anywhere. But all of a sudden we were showing, hey, this could scale. There's some level of product market fit here. There's a need. And so there were some angel investors who just reached out to me, said, hey, look, we'll write the check right now. You could quit your day job, work on this. You could imagine it was very tempting because this is what I wanted to work on. But the second or third meetings just didn't feel right. Not that they were, bad people, but they were saying, okay, well, we'll give this away for free, but we'll put this behind a paywall, or, the really valuable stuff we're gonna charge people for. And I was getting letters every day from folks all around the world saying how it was benefiting them. And I was thinking, well, I don't know if they are going to be able to access it, or whether they would even have the same level of trust if they knew that I was going to become a billionaire based on them learning off of this platform. And I also just started thinking, I read a lot of science fiction. I was like, oh, what's a home run as a for-profit? Oh, you could become a Google or a Facebook. And even that's very unlikely, but that's awesome if you can do it.
Yeah.
But I said, well, but my hedge fund job shows me that even some of these titans of for-profits, they seldom can keep that focus on their bottom line, on their mission for more than a generation. And that's only if they have very strong mission-focused founders. But you go 50 years, 60 years in the future, many of them have lost that. And the organizations that have been able to maintain a vision over multiple generations, if not centuries, have been nonprofits. Think of Harvard, think of University of Pennsylvania, think of Oxford, think of the Smithsonian. And so that was it's even less likely to start to be Benjamin Franklin and to start a University of Pennsylvania type legacy. But I said, well, why not? We have these type of institutions in the physical realm. Why couldn't we have them in the virtual realm? And then the last piece I thought about was, okay, at a very high level, what's the role of nonprofits? The for-profit sector does a lot of good. I'm a believer in capitalism. I'm a believer in market forces. But we know that there's certain places where either market forces don't lead to outcomes that are consistent with our values, or just the market's kind of broken. And education, and I would say probably to some degree healthcare, that's true. The decision makers, the payers, the beneficiaries are all different people. Even if you did align those things, you don't want to just give education, or I would argue healthcare, only to those who could afford it. And in theory, that could be the role of government. Obviously, the government does play a big role in actually both of those sectors, but government is also very slow, non-agile, very political. I mean, look, however people feel, you see that you don't want to be too dependent on the politics of government. And so I said, okay, well, that's where a nonprofit could play a role. And it felt like there was an opportunity that with relatively low capital, you could actually create an institution that could one day educate billions of people.
Yeah, I want to move the conversation to AI in education in particular, which is both the theme of your book, but also the theme of this podcast. You obviously have made a lot of progress with the original on-demand sort of learning model, but you had an aha moment yourself when you met with Sam Altman and Greg Brockman, and they did the demo of GPT 3.5 before ChatGPT was launched. Tell us a little bit about that meeting, what you saw, and how that changed your perspective on AI in education.
Yeah, and before, this was the summer of 2022 when all of this went down. Before that, we were exploring AI as ways to maybe make recommendations of what to do next, et cetera. Let's call it old school AI. And when we get this ping from Sam and Greg at OpenAI, I'm curious. I knew them. I respected them. I thought GPT-2 was very cool, even GPT-3 very cool, but not ready for prime time. And they said they were training their next model, so it wasn't even GPT 3.5. It was GPT-4 that they were showing. And this is, as you mentioned, months before ChatGPT came out, and ChatGPT was actually using 3.5. So what we were seeing, and what I was seeing, was the next generation, and actually not too different than even what the frontier models are capable of now. And when I saw that it could actually have not just something that looked like a conversation, but it could actually have a conversation, when it could, with a little bit of prompting, actually take on personas. And not just in a superficial way. It had a ton of issues. It still does, math errors, hallucinations, etc. But our true north at Khan Academy, when our mission as a nonprofit is free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. For us, or at least, and for me, world-class means not just having access to rigorous materials that are well done and engaging, but it also means a certain level of personalization. I've always talked. When we introduced mass public education, a lot of good happened in society, but we had to make compromises. We batch students together, 30 at a time, move them all together. Some kids are lost, some kids are bored. If you're upper middle class, you can afford personal tutors to help fill in gaps if the system's treadmill or assembly line isn't meeting your kids' needs, so to speak. But the gold standard has always been that type of one-to-one. Alexander the Great's teacher was Aristotle, and I'm sure would personalize it for the future emperor. And so our true north has always been, could we leverage technology to approximate elements of what Alexander the Great had with Aristotle? And, we've done it with videos, we've done it with software, and we've also done it with tools for teachers, because a teacher in a class of 30, how can they start to personalize, not have to do the same thing for all 30 students? And so when we saw the potential with GPT-4, we're like, okay, this, and you see the leap from 3 to 4 over 2 years, we said, okay, if this keeps going, this is going to be a huge support in terms of personalization, and actually supporting teachers directly with things like lesson plans, eventually grading papers, et cetera. So then we started investing heavily. Just as a little bit of a backstory, ChatGPT was a shock to everyone. We entered into a non-disclosure agreement with OpenAI. We were going to launch on the same day as GPT-4. We're going to launch Khanmigo, which is our AI assistant, teaching assistant tutor, on March 15th, 2023. It was November 30th, 2022 that ChatGPT comes out. And I remember slacking Greg Brockman. I'm like, what are y'all doing? You have us all lawyered up. And he said, no, we haven't launched anything. We just put a chat interface in front of an older model that's been out for 7 months. And the whole
Yeah.
world exploded. And they were caught by surprise. They had no idea that Chat GPT was going to become a thing. And I was pretty bummed. I thought like, wow, this thing is not ready for prime time. You can cheat with it. It's got more hallucinations, etc. But it turned out okay. And if anything, people, when we launched it, if only someone thought about it from a safety, pedagogy, non-cheating point of view, that would be pretty cool. And that's what we were doing.
Yeah, I think you said a few things there. One is on just the what's possible with use of AI in education. I want to talk about that in a minute. You also talked about the rate of change, which is actually pretty interesting. And I had a very similar experience when I wrote my book in 2017, which also I have here. It's called A Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence. But when I wrote that book in 2017, my goal was, can I write a chapter with AI? And I will not disclose it to readers until the end of the book. And at the end of the book, I would say, by the way, that chapter you read back there was written by AI. So my
And this was in
student
2017.
2017. But what
Wow.
happened was we couldn't do it. We tried a lot of tools. We could barely get 2-3 coherent paragraphs. And even those were not truly coherent. So to get a full chapter, impossible. So I gave up on that. So didn't do it. I first used GPT-2 in late 2019. In late 2020, we used GPT-3, and we had just started a company that was focused on bringing AI-enabled change to Hollywood. So we kind of felt like, look, where generative AI was going, media and entertainment would change dramatically. And so we built a company focused on how can producers analyze screenplays, how can they improve operations of the business all through AI. And again, the way it's been changing has been quite phenomenal. But it was a very similar experience of, one day, like in 2017, feeling like I can't do what I want to do with it. And then every year you're seeing a huge leap in the technology itself. I want to talk about what's possible in education. So you talked a little bit about getting excited with AI use, and of course there's lots of small things, lots of big things. But I'm curious, taking that 60,000 feet view of education, what is it that you kind of look at and say, here's something that is now possible with AI that I've wanted to do for a really long time, but was simply not possible to pull off back in the day?
Yeah, no, there's so much. And every time I talk, we come up with new ideas.
Yeah,
So
maybe you'll come up with something today. Yeah.
I'll start with maybe the most obvious, and then we can
Yeah.
go more and more bold.
Yeah.
The most obvious is a student is watching a video or doing an exercise on Khan Academy. And by the way, I still think that productive practice and immediate feedback, which is pre-generative AI, is still where most of the learning occurs in almost anything you do. But there's always been a legitimate critique of Khan Academy. Well, what if a student has a question that the video's not answering, or they want to dig deeper, or they're just stuck on a question, which is always, a high probability of disengagement. Well, an obvious use case is the AI being able to be there to support you Socratically. This is how I support my own kids when they're doing Khan Academy. If I see they're struggling, I'm like, hey, remember the distributive property, or what do you think are some possible steps here? I won't give them the answer. But I say, why don't you double check your work a little bit? Make sure you pay attention to your negative signs, things like that. On the teacher side, things like lesson plannings, progress reports, reviewing information for themselves, finding things, eventually grading. So I think that's kind of the first level. The next level, I would say, one of the biggest fears of generative AI is around writing. People cheating for writing. Does it undermine writing education? I have a chapter in the book about this. I start off in every chapter, before I even go into AI, I was like, well, what's the state of this issue before AI? And it turns out there's been a lot of cheating before AI existed. There's websites that'll get a PhD in Nigeria to write your paper for you for $5 a page. And that's always existed. ChatGPT just put a spotlight on it, lowered the cost to some degree. And so I think what AI will do is, and what's exciting is it's not just about policing students, but I actually think it'll give better feedback and better for students and better support for teachers. And these are also things that we're doing right now, which is a teacher can create the assignment with the AI, administer it through the AI. The AI does not do it for the student, but the AI can walk the student. Hey, let's do some brainstorming of your thesis. Let's do some outlining together, not just a traditional chat interface. And now let's do some drafting together. And the AI can support the student, give them feedback. And then once the student's ready to submit, the AI can submit it. And now the teacher doesn't just have the output, which has historically been all teachers get, professors get. They get the output, but they also get the whole process, and they can talk to the AI about the process. And that definitely it helps undermine cheating. In fact, all forms of cheating. If you borrowed a paper from a fraternity brother, it would say, hey, we didn't work on this. It just kind of copied and pasted in here. Or if you use ChatGPT, it would say that. But even more important, or I would argue more important, not only does it undermine any form of cheating, it can give the teacher insights that they might not have been able to have when they're grading 100 papers over a weekend. Hey, a lot of our students spend a lot more time, on coming up with a thesis. And actually about half of them didn't even know what a thesis is. So why don't we introduce this in tomorrow's lesson plan? Or a lot of students were doing well, but they were struggling with conclusions, or they were struggling with finding references that were legitimate, that had real information, things like that. And so that's the type of thing that teachers have trouble finding those trends if they're reading so many things. And we haven't done this yet, but I think it's imminent. There's the grading element where, our product manager at Khan Academy, who's leading this, used to be an English teacher, and she would say, look, every time she assigned a paper, she had 100 middle school papers to grade. She'd spend an average of 10 minutes on each one, which you don't get to go too deep when you only spend 10 minutes on it. But, that's 100 times 10 minutes. That's 1,000 minutes. That's a lot of time to be grading seventh grade papers on the Great Gatsby, and so it can help there and probably provide more consistent feedback and more consistent grading with the teacher being in the loop.
And by the way, I was going to say literally the hardest, the most painful thing about teaching that I have is the grading part. I love my time with the students in the classroom, but then at the end of the semester, you have to assign grades to them. And so there's this whole exercise of come up with questions just for the sake of testing and then give some grades. And you've got to go through 200, 300 students writing long essay questions. Incredibly time consuming.
No, and you're touching on something that, in every career, people are afraid of losing jobs to AI, et cetera. And look, that is going to happen for people who drive cars and retail, and if you're a copywriter or things like that. But for an educator, I think there's going to be huge liberation so that they can spend more time doing what you enjoy, interacting with students, being the conductor of what happens in the classroom, hopefully more interactive things, more engaging lessons, things like that. But, what I just said is almost like stage one. Stage two is generative AI can do much more simulation-based practice, simulation-based exercises, especially as it gets better and better at evaluating student work. It's okay now, but it's going to get better. So you can imagine the type of things you might get in a job interview where someone is, hey, how many quarters can you fit into 747? And they don't care that you get the exact right answer. They care that you're asking the right questions and that you can deduce your way into it. Right. You could do simulations where you're dealing with tough HR issues. So I would say that broadly, I would say, the category there is broadening the aperture of assessment and or making assessment more scalable and more consistent. This is happening in job interviews. This is happening in PhD oral thesis defenses, but those are very expensive assessments, and they're very inconsistent assessments and very inaccessible assessments. I think AI is going to go there. I think there's going to be really powerful ways of engaging students. We have activities where they can chat with simulations of historic figures or literary characters or even inanimate objects. Have a conversation with the Golden Gate Bridge. As you start having voice and visual, those conversations are just going to become richer. You could imagine a world where, and this could get creepy if we're not careful, but like say even your example, that the students are doing work through the AI. The AI is even observing your classroom and keeping track of who's saying what, and even giving them feedback on a daily basis. We're actually already experimenting with some of this. We have a peer-to-peer tutoring platform, free tutoring called schoolhouse.world, and we're using the AI is, quote, observing the tutoring and giving the tutors feedback on what they could do better, and now they're starting to give the students. But then in theory, at the end of the term, it could write a very meaningful valuation like, hey, you could have participated more. Sometimes you didn't follow the thread of the discussion, but you could, how it would be, this is the ultimate teaching assistant. If all of that stuff is just seamlessly done for you as the professor. So we're working a lot on this, let's call it the preparation, the delivery, and then the assessment loop. And how can we really put all the machinery in there to make that workflow as simple as possible for the teacher, and as engaging and effective as possible for the student. I mean, we could go further, job interviews, and your AI agent is talking to the employer's agent, which has an analog in the real world called agents and recruiters. And if you're a sports star or you're a celebrity, you get that. But I think maybe we'll all have that in 5 years. So and in 5-10 years, you'll put on your Apple Vision 5, and you and your classroom are going to go on a magic school bus ride, and you're going to go to ancient Rome, and you're going to try to stop the Ides of March from happening, or whatever, or maybe help with it. I don't know, but so it could be pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there. Some speculation also in terms of whether those realities will come to pass or not, because there are obstacles and challenges with each of them. But let's talk for a minute about where we are today. You guys have launched this tool, Khanmigo, which, personally, I kind of feel like when people ask me what are some good AI tools that I've seen that I enjoy and I like, Khanmigo usually is in my top 5 recommendations. So let's talk a little bit about what is Khanmigo and what is it currently doing for your learners. Again, that wasn't feasible, say, 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, the already on Khanmigo, if a student has a question, a video, exercise, it knows the context of what the student's doing, and so they can have a nice Socratic conversation about it. It has a sense of memory, so if you've told it in the past that you're into basketball, it'll try to connect that. And of course, you can see all the inferences that it's made on you, and you can reset it. You can say, no, I want to be a doctor now, etc. It is able to surface all of that to parents and teachers, so that parents and teachers can have conversations with the AI. Hey, what's my child been up to? What are they struggling with? For teachers, it can report trends that it's seeing across a classroom. Hey, here's some kids that you might want to compliment because they've just done this. Here's some kids that are really struggling. Maybe we want to do this with them. Here's some trends as we develop the next lesson plan together that we can do. We have a whole set of teacher tools there. In terms of the things that it's allowing us to think about that we couldn't seriously think about before, if you asked me 5 years ago, is Khan Academy going to be able to cover like true writing instruction or writing practice? I was like, oh, that's hard. It's hard to evaluate that type of subjective work. Or is Khan Academy ever going to be able to cover like soft skills with practice and feedback? Like, oh, that's hard. But now I see a path. We're already tackling writing with Khanmigo and these tools. There was a 60 Minutes piece a few months ago that goes into a lot of detail on that. But I can imagine in 5 years that we can give you practice and assessment on giving a presentation, on brainstorming, on drawing something, on designing an experiment or designing a contraption and visually drawing it, or even just showing a video of the thing, and it's able to give you feedback. And, my hope is, you touch on, in theory, all of this is doable and plausible, but the question is, how do you get the system to change? And I'm a big believer is, if you can create assessments and credit and credentials that people start caring about, that leverages some of this, then the system will start to change. If employers start to say, hey, I want to see your portfolio, and instead of I, as the employer, having to go in and evaluate everyone's contraptions and everyone's writing samples, I get a trusted read from Khan Academy on how good of a writer you are and how good of a designer you are, etc. That, I think, could be a more valuable signal than getting a bachelor's or an MFA from one of the fanciest design schools. And so I think once you start having things like that, or we are working on the future of standardized assessment at Khan Academy, where if you augment traditional standardized assessment with asking students to explain their reasoning or to write out their thoughts before they see the multiple choice, and we can give more insights to teachers, if that becomes the future of assessment, then I think that also becomes the future of practice and what happens in the class.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, you're painting a very nice, positive, rosy picture of what can happen. But people have many concerns as well with AI use in education. And by the way, I mostly agree with your assessment. Having read your book, I think you and I have very similar conclusions, even though our reasoning process to get there is quite different, is what I gathered from it. But let's talk about those concerns because I don't want people, our listeners, to feel like we swept those under the rug. I think there are some very important concerns. One of the big ones that one keeps hearing about is, will AI ultimately become a crutch for students and that they become very dependent on it? And in fact, this is not just a hypothesis. Some early studies are bringing up those concerns. One of my colleagues, Hamza Bastani, has a paper where they looked at AI use in tutoring and teaching. And specifically in their research study, teachers teach a topic and then students take practice problems before eventually taking a grading exam. And some of the students don't have any access to AI during the practice sessions, while other students do. And they had two different ways in which the students could use the AI tutors. And what they found was that the groups that use the AI in the practice sessions, their scores went up a fair bit for both the groups. But then when it came to the final unassisted grading exam, the scores actually went down for the groups that had AI. And mostly their conclusion was that students were overly optimistic about their understanding of the concept and their performance when they were using the GPT. So it's not just a theoretical concern, but some early studies are showing this. This is not the only one, but a few have brought this up. How do you react to that? I'm sure you have your own assessments. There's a design question here. There's many pieces to it, but how do you react to that concern that AI could become a crutch for students at the end of the day?
Yeah, I'm a bit familiar with that study, and I with everything AI, I always try to draw a parallel in the real world, in the pre-generative AI world. And for me, that study isn't surprising because if we did the exact same study, but instead of saying you have access to AI, you say you have access to a human being tutor. I think the devil's all in the details of what that human being tutor is doing. I think, look, we all know friends and family and parents and tutors that are over enabling, that are essentially doing the work for the student or just doing what it takes for them to go through it quickly. And if I remember that study, I think there was, the students who did the worst were the ones that were kind of just using AI to just get through the problem sets as fast as possible. And they were probably getting over assistance. But a really thoughtful tutor or will make someone engage in productive struggle. So, hey, I'm not like, no, keep working on it. I think you're close. I'm not going to tell you the answer. Yes, just struggle a little bit. But if they see that the student's about to disengage or really hitting their head against a wall, hey, here's a little hint. Here's a little nudge. Oh, okay, you get it. Now you're going to move forward. And that is definitely better than disengaging. If, I don't think anyone's going to benefit from completely not being able to engage in a practice set. And so I think the same thing is going to be true in AI. And I think that's true of every problem. When we think about over-reliance, once again, you get an over-reliance on your fraternity brothers, on, the service that gets people to write for you from Nigeria. You could get over-reliance on Chat GPT. I think there's another world where actually we have a problem of under-reliance. I think because there's been mixed signals about whether it's ethical or not. Like, I'm trying to push the team at Khan Academy where, as shepherds of our donors' money, we need to use as productively as possible. Like, use generative AI. Like, our engineers are already seeing productivity, but like some of them, there's a little bit of they don't want to use it, even though it could make them more accelerated. I was like, no, you should be using it. It'll make you better. And what we're actually seeing, and this is the narrative I believe, is the people who are deepest in their crafts are the ones that are seeing the best amplification. That's anecdotal. Haven't run a study, but we're seeing that with our engineering team. I'm seeing that with our writing team, with like when we do grant write, have to write grants and things like that, when we have to create content. So yes, I 100% think all technology can amplify intent, and that intent can be negative intent, can be positive intent, or it could be lazy intent. Yeah. And students sometimes have lazy intent. And when you're trying to develop your skills, that lazy intent can undermine you. Yeah. And so we just have to make sure there's proper oversight and proper AI tools, and ways of even working in the classroom where they can't, where there's guardrails so they can't amplify that lazy intent so it hurts them.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I think what you're pointing out is that that study, or what I just presented about that study, is perhaps less about AI and more about tutoring methodology. If you
That's right.
tutor a certain way, whether it's humans or AI, you will end up with that kind of outcome. And I saw a more recent study. This is Lehman and co-authors from University of Cologne and Rotterdam and so on, and they did find, I guess, to support what you were saying, that if the LLM is used more conversationally, asking for explanations and interacting and get, things like that, they were seeing some benefits. So it's mostly around how you design the AI human interaction. So that makes sense. I want to go back to the comment you made about cheating, and I think that's the other question that comes up. And you made it earlier about, you made the point that, well, there's a concern about AI and cheating, and of course, every professor and every university right now has to think about, how do I assess, how do I do my give students homeworks and exams and so on, when you've got the ability to answer it easily with ChatGPT support. And I think you made the point that cheating was possible before too, but I think you interestingly also made the case that assessments have to evolve. So I would love to get into that a little bit more. First of all, what is your attitude towards, as you said, lazy intent, somebody using the AI ultimately to bypass the learning and get homeworks done and so on? And where do you think assessments need to go going forward? Or is that
Yeah.
the main solution you're advocating?
Yeah, well, and that's, the chapter in the book about cheating, I was actually, I suspected, okay, cheating already exists to some degree, but I said, let me just see what the state of cheating is, especially in higher education. And actually, I was somewhat shocked that there's probably cheating there was cheating when you and I were in school. It's gotten a lot worse. And there's surveys from Middlebury College, there's surveys from Stanford. Stanford had a very, I think, a strange honor code where they did not even let professors in the room when a test was being administered, which I think
Oh,
shows like a
wow.
lack of trust in the professor. I don't think that builds trust. And what you had happening, and this was in some of these reports I was reading, and also talking to some kids at Stanford, validated, is that they would see kids openly cheating on exams. When I was in college, yeah, you could work with friends on a homework. And sometimes if the homework was just busy work, like there was no shame in like, hey, let's collaborate. But oftentimes it's productive. You're tutoring each other, et cetera. But at least for me, when I was in college, it didn't even cross my mind to cheat on an exam. That was like, I would have really looked down on someone who did that. But, apparently there's open cheating, and people, the honor code, if you see it, you're supposed to report it, but then you're ruining that person's life. So no one does it. And people know. I talked to a friend at, MIT, where I went to undergrad, and this is a young guy who just graduated, and he was in a fraternity, and he's like, well, you don't know, Sal, there's a lot. I don't know if it's cheating, but it's close to it, where all the people in the dorms. I was in the dorm. They're studying art, but all the fraternities have the last 30 years of exams. And
Right.
if you review the last 30 years of exams, very few professors are taking the trouble of writing truly novel questions. They're changing some of the numbers, or they're like, oh, I'll take an item from 8 years ago. Well, guess what? The kids in the fraternity saw that. And so they had this huge advantage. And I'm not even sure if that's officially cheating, but that's definitely, I think, an unfair advantage. So, and then there's the, people always talk about Khan Academy. How do we know if it's someone's work, and authentication? And we have mechanisms now to do that. We have with Schoolhouse to record you and peer review your video. But I say, when you take these classes in college with 300 kids in the room, no one's checking your ID. And even if they are, they're not really checking your ID. So, there are item security, questions, and then, to your point, what is on the assessment? I think the base is you should be creating more items, and you should be actually making sure that it's people's work. But even more than that, can you create tasks for, say, take home work, that yeah, let people use an AI, but it's still they're still going to need some skill and craft in order to do it well. At the higher education, go make people find out novel information, go interview people, go look up in, city records, go start a business and yeah, write about it. Maybe you use AI, but once again, to write well, you should have a good sense, an editorial sense of what great writing looks like. You can also create other settings where no, it's everything's happening in the classroom. And so you can be very confident that that writing is definitely that student's writing. And then there's the in between, like we mentioned, where you can work with the AI and the AI can make the process transparent to the professors. So I think there's ways to address it. But as I said, these are not new problems. I'm glad people are finally talking about it because I think 90% of the problem existed before generative AI and people just pretended it didn't exist.
Yeah, I suspect there is truth to it. If anything, it's just made it a lot easier. But yeah, there's no doubt the problem existed. I wonder whether when we look at these problems, like whether it's cheating or whether it could be a crutch for students or even things like accuracy, hallucination, all of that stuff. I wonder if there are any parallels to when the internet came in and you were trying to bring video-based on-demand learning to students. Did these kinds of concerns come up with what was then a new technology, whether it's like, is it distracting for students or does it affect their attention span? I'm kind of curious whether you've heard this kind of pushback back then. Are there any parallels, anything to learn from there?
We heard variations of it. There was definitely, hey, is this going to replace teachers, et cetera? And I was like, look, a video lecture that's done reasonably well could, if all of a teacher is doing is giving a lecture. But if a teacher is running a Socratic dialogue, doing simulations, making students go work in breakouts, et cetera, then yeah, the videos just could actually enable that type of thing. I think some of the critique is like, oh, you don't just learn from an explanation. You learn from practice and feedback. And this is one where I think it's just people just weren't aware that we also believe that. The Khan Academy from day one has actually put most of its resources on the practice platform. And the feedback platform and the teacher analytics and tools and things like that. And the videos are just there as a supplement. And so we too agree. Now, I think an on-demand video is better than a 90-minute lecture or 60-minute lecture because a student can pick what they need. They can pause, repeat. They can try to work out the problem themselves, which we encourage people to do in the videos. But the real practice is where they're going to learn the most. So yeah, and then some of the critiques is, well, what about engagement? How do you engage people? I'm like, look, I agree. I think engagement is everything in education, and to some degree or to a large degree, things like Khan Academy have made it much easier to engage. When you and I were in school, if you were motivated, you could power through a textbook on your own. But I'm guessing you and I probably did have the determination to go to the library, check out a textbook, and power through it. But that was 1% of kids. And now with on-demand video, searchable, digital practice, maybe with some game mechanics like Khan Academy has or Duolingo has, and now AI to help you answer questions, the activation energy is just lower. But still, you still need more motivation. We're still seeing many cases that, in most cases, the teacher is a very, very instrumental tool to motivate most kids to engage. So I think the critiques are when people look narrowly, like, hey, this by itself isn't a silver bullet. This by itself isn't going to solve all the problems. And we tend to agree with that. It'll make some of the parts of the problems easier, but it's still a lot of dimensions to it.
Yeah. Sal, I want to move the conversation into a slightly different direction. I want to talk about jobs a little bit and skilling. So, of course, there's a lot of talk about AI's ability to dislocate people from their jobs and impact their sense of purpose. How do you look at that problem? I'm sure a lot of parents come to you and talk about these kinds of questions and concerns for their kids and so on. How do you assess it?
Yeah, and I think about it at every level. I believe someone told me that someone asked Jeff Bezos what's his biggest desire for his kids, and he said that they have a sense of purpose. Which is very powerful, right? Coming from someone whose kids arguably will have no material constraints. And, when I think about it, that's exactly right. That's what I also want for my kids. There was a time in my life that, if you asked me what success looks like, I would say, oh, it's to, have the corner suite or to be well known or to, discover something, you get a Nobel Prize. My answer to that is very different now. Mine is to have a sense of purpose, a sense of community, to have people around you that you care about, that care about you. And that sense of purpose, yes, it could be, doing something global scale, but it could also be, being in your community and doing something for other people that is needed and that is valued. So I think this is even before generative AI, we've had a problem here. You have so many, we measure GDP, which is really a measure of material productivity, but a lot has good happened. I mean, you do need material wealth to some degree, but we live in a society that has a loneliness epidemic where I think if you really got people, even highly educated people, highly compensated people with fancy titles about their meaning and purpose, they would probably tell you that they don't feel a lot of it. And so how do we do that? I think some of it is to try to rebuild some of these senses of community and balance in people's lives, et cetera. But a lot of it, but if you don't have a job and if you can't put food on the table, it's going to be hard to feel also needed and have purpose. So there's going to be dislocation. As I mentioned, the biggest employer of men between ages 18 and 55 globally is driving some type of a vehicle. That's going to go away in the next 10 years. Retail, and even some things that require a lot of education. People have been talking about radiology for a little while now. People talk about, writing in certain cases, technical writing, things like that, are likely to go away. So I think it's an imperative that someone needs to create pathways of reskilling and recredentialing so that you can go into the jobs of the future. And the jobs of the future, yes, there will be new jobs in the knowledge economy that leverage AI and it's evolving every day, whether it's like a prompt engineer or some type of, vibe coder or whatever it might be. But I actually think there's going to be in a wealthier, more productive society, there's actually going to be more demand and desire for very human-centered jobs. So being able to, like the whole hospitality industry. Hospitality only exists in a wealthy society. If you go to a society that's barely getting by, no one's going to hotels, no one's going to restaurants, no one's going to shows. So I think there's actually something there. I think, in research and development and, caring for our elderly and do the arts, hopefully there'll be more opportunity there. But yeah, we need to create pathways for that laid off truck driver to become a home health worker or a nurse or a vibe coder.
Yeah. I tend to think about work as any job as like a series of tasks, and every job will have tasks impacted. Some jobs may have more tasks that are automated, meaning those jobs are more in threat. And there's no doubt that there's, a shift that's going to happen that, we probably expect like labor's share of national capital, national income will decrease, and surplus will shift towards capital. There are many risks. And I feel like when we look at that, the solution for me has to be entrepreneurship. How do you encourage more entrepreneurship? And then reskilling. How do you help people reskill? And you are in the business of skilling. So I'm really curious, what's your take on what skills will matter going forward?
So, I mean, the first part of that, I think a lot of the traditional skills of critical thinking, math, reading, writing, are going to continue to matter. I say, look, if you really want to be able to amplify your productivity, you should be able to hang with the tools that you're using. No one wants an editor who can't write as well as the staff writers. No one wants a software engineering architect or manager who can't code as well as the coders. And the future staff writers and coders are AIs, but you're going to have to put the pieces together and elevate. So I think all of those traditional skills, I want those for my own children, especially anyone who's going to participate in the knowledge economy. I think above and beyond that, we have always known that, we've always called them soft skills, communication skills, empathy. Those are going to continue to be very important. I was going to say become more important, but they've always been important. It's just they don't show up in your SAT score. They don't show up on your college transcript anywhere. But I think there's going to be mechanisms to create better signals there. I mean, it's interesting because, right now, imagine someone who's an Uber driver now in 10 years, there's no human Uber drivers, but they're an incredible conversationalist. They're an incredible salesman. That person has a role in society. I would love, people would love to hire them, but how do they signal? Maybe they don't have a college degree. How do they signal that they could be a great drug salesman, or they could go work at an enterprise software company selling people? I hope, and this is we do have some very nascent projects on this. Can we leverage AI to assess someone in some of these dimensions, and then create a signal like, this is one of the best salespeople in the world? Like, it convinced the AI that they needed a Stairmaster or something. Or this person is actually really creative and really funny. You think about people who work in advertising, or you mentioned entertainment, and who write scripts. Right now they kind of select from people even there who went to the right schools, who worked at the Harvard Lampoon. And did that really matter? There's some super hilarious creative people who dropped out of high school. If they can show that, they're going to not have to, be unemployed because a robot replaced their driving job. They're going to be able to show that they're one of the most talented people in that dimension. So I'm hoping that AI can play a role in assessment, but you're absolutely right. We need to get very serious. And this is, I view, part of our broader charter. We are also working on academics, ways that people can get high school diplomas, et cetera. And, that's to be a safety net for the young girl in Afghanistan who can't go to school, to the kid in rural Alaska who doesn't have access to a calculus class. So we're doing that. I'm hoping to do college credits, but I also hope that we can do this job placement no matter how old you are, and we can discover things about you that are very valuable, whether or not you have a college degree or whether or not you passed calculus.
Yeah, I think that's a great optimistic note to end this discussion. I think one of the big takeaways, and it's a viewpoint I've had for a while, which is that AI can bring in a lot of the content skills, arithmetic, language, programming, but you still need it to put the pieces together. And your emphasis on social emotional skills, collaboration, communication, critical thinking, creativity, I think that's really important as well. So great to see that emphasis. One of the things I'm taking away is you sound very optimistic about the future, even though you're recognizing the challenges. Where does that optimism come from?
The way I see it, we have no choice but to be optimistic. As we were talked about multiple times, technology amplifies human intent. Bad people are going to do bad things with the AIs and other technologies. They're going to do deep fakes and fraud, and there's other technologies, CRISPR, et cetera. I hate to imagine what designer viruses and pathogens of the future look like. And so good people hopefully have they have one of two options: either just sit and watch as the world turns into a dystopian nightmare, or they say, look, most people I think are good. I think 95% of people have positive intent. If we can amplify that positive intent, but lean into it, we have a really good chance of coming out of this on the other side and as a more utopian than dystopian society.
Sal, I think we have our episode here, and we did it without AI, just two human beings. So that was great. Thank you so much for being our first guest on Creative Intelligence.
Thanks for having me, Kartik.
This was a really interesting conversation with Sal. One of the big takeaways for me is how, at the end of the day, AI is yet another tool available to us. It could be used to amplify positive intent, but it could also be used to amplify lazy or poor intent as well. And people have brought up many concerns with AI, like, can it become a crutch for students? Will it encourage cheating and so on? And ultimately, I think what I heard from Sal is a lot of optimism, that we have a lot of agency here. There's an opportunity to redesign education in interesting ways. For example, why does assessment need to be the way it is done today, where, say, in schools or colleges, there's 2-3 questions and students answer that. There's a homework where they might do that, but what if the assessment could be interactive, where they're interacting with the AI, which follows up with more questions? How could you change tutoring and teaching itself so that there's more of a Socratic method, so AI doesn't need to be a crutch, but instead could be an interactive resource that is evaluating when a student is losing interest and likely to disengage, and actually starting to give the student feedback or assistance or hints that might help increase their engagement. I tend to agree with him. There is going to be some pain along the way, But ultimately, this is our opportunity to redesign education and come up with a new format that is ultimately more effective. And I do feel optimistic that we will get there the way that Sal also feels. Sal also brought up the skills that will be important in the future. And one of the important points he made was that reading, arithmetic will be relevant in the future as well. I have a pretty strong view on this. I do believe that AI is going to come in and take over a lot of the content skills, meaning writing, arithmetic, programming, so on. But ultimately, I do feel that while AI can do those content skills, we still need to understand it well so that we can piece things together, so we know how to evaluate AI output and know it's not hallucinating, so that we can be careful about how we use AI. I also feel that, while there are content skills, there's a number of other related skills that will become more important in the presence of AI. Some educators call them like the C skills, meaning creativity, critical thinking, compassion, collaboration, communication, confidence. I think all of these will become extremely important. They will impact how we work together, how we become more entrepreneurial and come up with new problems to solve and new solutions to those problems. So ultimately, there is no doubt that there will be change. There is no doubt that there will be some pain along the way. But at the same time, I can see potentially a new world which doesn't have to necessarily be that painful. Ultimately, we can use AI as a tool to amplify the positive intent, to amplify and accelerate our way to that better future. So those are my big takeaways. Thank you so much for joining us today. That brings us to the end of our series premiere. Thank you for listening. Please follow us so you don't miss an episode. You can join the conversation in many ways. You can follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, where I post my views on AI quite frequently. You can also sign up for my newsletter at Hosanagar, which is my last name, hosanagar.substack.com. And you can leave your suggestions for future episodes as comments below. Be sure to tune in next time. This was Creative Intelligence, and I'm Kartik Hosanagar. See you soon.